Hi, everyone. My name is Patricia Kong, and I'm here today to talk to you quickly about the essence of scaling and empowering teams with the Nexus framework. So, I really appreciate being a part of the Experience Agile conference this year, 2021, and I hope that I can participate in person soon. I'm really excited to be able to do that again soon. Anyways, like I said, my name is Patricia. I'm not gonna I'm not going to dive so much into the nuts and bolts, we'll say, of the Nexus framework because it is in the Nexus guide on scrum.org. But I want to make sure, just so you know, that the conversation that I'm going to invite today, or the thinking that I'm going to invite today, is really, what are the outcomes and the benefits of scaling? What is really the essence of the Nexus framework? Why do we think about something so simple? And why is it the way it is? Because I think that there has been enough time and enough talks about which framework and what does it look like here. I really like people to think about, especially as we're coming out of the pandemic or post-pandemic or post-COVID or experiencing COVID, as we think about how organizations are investing and how they spend their time. So what can we be more focused and diligent about? So I'm going to lead this talk that way. Scrum.org, large community, we're all virtual. We have been for about a couple of years, and we continue to dedicate ourselves to improving professionalism and helping teams and people solve complex problems. So that's a little bit me. I'm down there on the right somewhere trying to, we were trying to think about how are we going to continue doing this, and we're making it through and thriving. So a little bit about me. If you don't know me, enterprise agility at scrum.org, it means that whatever is going on at the team level from an agile perspective, those benefits, I think about what are those barriers and what are those benefits that we can think about at the organization. So topics around scaling and evidence-based management. How do we make decisions based off of evidence in an organization? How do we do that in complex environments? Those are things that I think about. Leadership, management. Outside of that, I'm also a mentor, especially helping people who are underprivileged think about what they can do, especially in the knowledge work industry. So organizational behavior, very interested and curious about why people do and think the things that they do, why organizations act the way they do, probably because I come from a corporate background. And that's what led me to Agile and Scrum. So why scale? A lot of times what we saw previously is that a lot of organizations were running towards this notion of scaling is because everybody else was doing it. Learned it at a conference, or that area is working really well. Let's do it everywhere. But I think it's serious to ask this question, why are we scaling? What is the need? Especially when we're probably coming from an area where the workforce has been contracted, and now we want to think about how we're going to invest more. Where does that make the most impact for us as an organization? So is it because we want to go faster? Is it because we want to go faster with more people, less people? Hopefully the answer is really that we're trying to get more value faster. When we don't ask ourselves those sorts of questions, and we're not having that transparent conversation in the organization, and we just go, you know what, we have this many people, we're in a scaled environment, a lot of that fragmentation happens. And what happens generally that I see is that we end up scaling overhead that's unnecessary, and also bad habits. And that those bad habits might be, besides the processes, the bad habits might be not having enough education where we should about an area, not having mastered, let's say, engineering practices where we should, the way we communicate, how we think about our product structure, how we think about those initiatives, the behaviors of people, what we value, all those things might happen, and we scale those. And especially, for instance, the miseducation that we might have, or the misconcepts that we might have about something like the Scrum framework or something, right? And so we scale those types of thoughts, those types of behaviors, and it kind of grows and grows. And eventually somebody has to pay for a consultant or a bunch of consultants to say, hey, that looks a little bit, and we start again. And so it's a cycle there. And so that there's 3 questions that I ask organizations to think about when they're thinking about scaling, and it's looking a little bit unhealthy. And it's, did you try to scale too early? Were you too fast? And was it unrestrained, right? So did we consider what must be done? If we're adding people together and teams together and we're going to be stepping on each other's toes, have we thought about what it's going to look like in order for us to work together and to integrate our work? Are we pushing change on the team? Are we pushing process on the team? Are we pushing change on the team? What does that really look like? Was that right? Where is that buy-in? And then the second thing that I think that is really important, especially when we're starting to think about scaling, is did we balance the costs and benefits of the overhead with value? And the way that I usually think about this is scaling is math with common sense, right? And that's really what that is. That's math and common sense. So when we balance the costs and benefits, if we know that when we're going to be adding teams, what we should be seeing is that at some point those costs start to make sense and it starts to go down. When we think about working together and everybody stepping on each other, are we putting the things that we need in place to lift up that transparency so that we're not adding layers of decision making and losing that time and spending that money on things that might not even be worth it? Are we thinking about the value of actually why we're scaling, what outcome we're looking at, and for the customer? Are we making an assumption, for instance, that we're going to make this initiative to build a mobile app that will completely replicate the website because that's what we assume that the customer wants? When, for instance, in a bank, the behavior of a customer who uses a bank app is very different, for instance, that we found for a bank than what they would do on a website. So what does that mean? That means that we don't have to build everything and replicate the whole same thing. So we are not thinking about that notion of math and common sense. The third thing that we look at for an organization is to really understand that their scaling initiatives are unique. So it might mean some of the basic things that we know that are tried and true, they make sense for them. But there's a lot of difference in terms of what the structure of an organization looks like, the culture, the goals, the challenges, their current practices, their domains of competence, the people that they have, the language they speak, the infrastructure that they have. All those things are going to be a little bit different. So we can't just say, hey, everything we can copy paste anything there. So we tried to think about, for that, when we thought about these questions, when we think about these questions and ask these questions, of where do we start then? So Scrum.org, we're going to start with the team in the middle, and we're going to start with the Scrum framework. So for teams at the very basic level, when we're starting from those little behaviors, those good behaviors we want to scale, we start with, okay, we're working on one product backlog, we're working on one product, and we're trying to produce one thing, at least every sprint, right? And so we said, what happens when multiple teams work together? What else are we going to need to make sure that the dependencies don't corrupt the outcome that we're looking for, right? So we're not stepping on each other's toes all the time. Everybody's going in all different directions, and we might not even understand what our project is. We're saying, if you just add more teams to work together on the same thing, what should that look like? So you see that product backlog still there, one product, and we just have a little bit more in terms of, when are those connection points that we would talk about? What are those things that we would have to do to make sure that we're collaborating and working toward that Nexus goal? All of us working toward together as a Nexus. And honestly, a lot of this you can just find in the Nexus guide. We updated it recently, 2021, to be updated with the Scrum guide. But the one thing that I will say that might not be always expressed is this notion of the Nexus integration team. That Nexus integration team is there to have appropriate representatives, mostly from the different teams, so that one, we can scale out good practices and also have a representation of bottom up intelligence. That focus is hyper on integration to make sure that we're doing that so that people can just do their best work. Um, so there's a lot of that. That is not a management team. That is not an integration team. But it is really about integrating the Nexus and really helping in terms of thinking about the killer of scaling, which is dependencies. All right, so that is something that you can read about. And the purpose of the Nexus framework is to attack that killer of scaling, which is the dependencies that we face. We think about how we can be ongoing and persistent, very, very focused. We want to think about what are the things that we can put in place minimally before the work occurs so that we don't figure it all out after and work in a scramble. And then what we do is we make sure that we suggest that organizations and teams think about their complementary practices. We've listed out a bunch on the website, and there are going to be different ones that work for different companies and different teams and different structures. But this notion that just putting down a framework is going to save you is not going to happen because it's just going to tell you where we need to get better. The thing that I really want to point out, though, is this notion of descaling. So that's the last bullet that I've talked about. If you're thinking about Nexus, what is one of the practices you might want to consider? And it's the notion of descaling. Because if you think about it, if the goal of Nexus is to scale the value that a group of Scrum teams who are working on one thing that they produce, if we're scaling because we want to scale value that more than one Scrum team can produce, and if we need to increase transparency in order to do that, because that will help us work together, and it is too complex when there are too many teams working together, then the obvious thing that we should try, is to reduce those number of teams. So it's really this notion where I'm thinking about scaling right now, not as in more, but as in what can we do to reduce that complexity, and sometimes descaling is it. And so that takes a lot of ego to say, you know what, I don't need all those teams. How else can we serve the organization? What else does that mean? But this notion of scaling down is a really important practice, so much so that we've articulated it in the last update of the Nexus guide. So those are some things that I wanted to share, some common themes across the Nexus implementations that we've noticed. And there's a lot actually going. We were really happy to work to hear about a company that was working with the Polish Ministry of Health and how they were able to say, you know what, we've been trying scaling for all these years. We finally just said, you know what, let's start back from the basics. We understand Scrum. Let's do that. And they were able to get a platform running that helped the government be prepared for COVID in terms of helping patients. Those things are amazing. And when we hear that, and you can find the case studies online, but the themes that make it where they're saying, you know what, we just had a problem and we need to solve it. And it goes, we know Scrum, ROI of Scrum knowledge. If you know Scrum, this is going to feel like an old jacket to you. It's going to feel the same. It's a way for us to have better alignment with business. We have a Nexus sprint goal. In Scrum, we have the product goal. So that addition really aligns nicely because we say, what is that thing that we're trying to work on as a whole? And that gets an identity going of a Nexus. We're doing this for the Nexus. It's not just my team. We're doing this for a Nexus. And so what happens is that if we need to move with the ebb and flow, we are able to make decisions faster. And we get to move from a project mindset to a product mindset because we're saying, what do we need to do? What do we need to do for this Nexus toward that product goal? We've seen that there's that faster time to market, probably because of the reduced level of decision making, and then the increased ROI. So a lot of focus on outcomes is what I'm asking for now. And the bottom line usually always is around the team morale, the cohesion that people are facing, that people are experiencing. when they're working together towards one single thing. And there's a lot of psychology, obviously, behind that. But those are really some nice themes that are across Nexus implementations. There's different case studies, there's webinars. But essentially, if you want to get started, you think about that Scrum experience. So do you understand Scrum? Are the teams identified? Do you have a Nexus integration team? Usually that's voluntary basis. You will see those people who are thinking about that generally if you're working on that definition of done, a single one, and a single product backlog, and a sprint cadence identified. Those are really the things that you'll have if you're using Scrum that you'll start to think about. And obviously the common challenges are around alignment, stabilization, and dependencies. So that was really quick. You can learn more about the Nexus framework in the Nexus guide, and that's on scrum.org. We have a workshop that helps people and teams go through and say, wow, we're experiencing these different problems, these different challenges. What are some practices that we can learn? How would you use that in the context of Nexus? So the class walks through, what does it feel like to be doing Nexus sprint planning and then assessment? Last thing that I do want to point out here, actually, since we're talking about the workshop and assessment, is when we talk about that foundation is quite important, because what I notice when people are scoring on our assessment and certification, when we look at our questions, the assessment for Scaled Professional Scrum with Nexus is broken down into 3 categories. Nexus framework. Do you understand Nexus? Have you read the guide? Application of that and scaling fundamentals. So what are the fundamentals that we have to do to scale? And there's 2 things that I've been observing, these 2 patterns that are interesting, is that people score lowest and they struggle the most in the category of scaling fundamentals. So again, this is when I talked about what bad habits are we scaling when we don't think about those. And the second thing is that a lot of people assume that when we plan together at scale, we must make sure that everyone is busy. That's the translation that I'm making from this question, these questions, is that the purpose of planning is to make sure that everyone is busy. So those are things that we want to watch and think about. Why would that make sense? Does that make sense? Rather than to think about what are the dependencies and the challenges that we might face. So those are just things that I just observed today that I really want to share with you. And I want to thank you for your time. You can learn more. We have a book that walks through a case study of teams that are challenged with the scaling initiative. We have different case studies, different webinars. You'll see people who talk about why did they choose Nexus? What did they use it for? Why didn't they use the other ones? Or did they? Or how did it work? Did they use it together? So there's different things there. And a lot of the times they will talk about the evidence that they had to say that that math was there and the common sense to help them scale. So thank you for your time. Please feel free to connect with me. My name is Patricia Kong again, and you can contact me on LinkedIn or patricia.kong@scrum.org. Thank you.